Before we start, I just want to give a quick intro to myself. I'm a 20-year product leader from a lot of tech startups, most recently Airtable and Gusto, and then maybe like 2.5 years ago, left to go find my place in climate. I thought I was going to get another tech job at a climate tech company, and that didn't work out, and a long whirlwind of events, and I'm happy to share that with anybody who's interested, led me to coaching. And so now I coach climate founders, and I'm also the host of this podcast called Any Job Can Be a Climate Job. And here I find amazing people who are doing great things for the planet from within their jobs, which can have multiplier effects on how fast we tackle our climate crisis, and try to share them with people, because I really do believe everybody and every job needs to be participating if we're going to make the difference that we need to make. And so we should share that information freely and openly. And I'm so excited to partner with Carl, Climate Action Resource Library, who's making amazing PDF guides for different jobs. So it's a really nice complement to the podcast. And today we're going to be talking to 3 people. We're going to be chatting with Charlie. Charlie is a tech and sustainability expert. He also has a new book that it just launched, right? And he's had an amazing career at Gartner and then Microsoft, and is going to share some incredible stories from that. And Gabe is a tech and product climate innovator and is the founder of Moon 5, which is bringing EV charging to apartment buildings. And Shruti's built some incredible green teams. She's really passionate about grassroots change. She's going to talk about individual action and how education can really cause ripple effects down the line. So I'm really happy to have all 3 of you here. That was a really brief overview, but I'd love for each of you to maybe give a little bit more background on who you are and why climate's important to you.
So super excited to be here. Hi, everybody. It's super fortunate that I bumped into Louisa when I did, because this book that I mentioned yesterday is all about the things we can do in our personal, professional, and political lives to make a difference on climate change. It's a climate optimism book. And I'm the overlap, which is quite fun, is this notion that any job can be a climate job. It's both the name of Louisa's podcast. It's also the name of the second chapter of my book. It's about, because I kind of built my climate career despite having no background in climate. Started at Gartner as effectively a glorified events manager, which I'll talk more about later. And I somehow managed to go from being an events manager at Gartner to now leading sustainability for Microsoft's data center business. So beforehand, before everybody joined, we were talking a little bit about how AI becomes more sustainable. And turns out that's now my job to figure out. And who would have thought that 5 years ago, I should say, when I was an events manager for an IT advisory company. But this is part of the journey that we're all going to talk to. So that's my quick little background. Otherwise, I'm based in Minneapolis. The reason I love climate is because I love snow, and I don't want snow to go away.
Thanks, Charlie. Gabe, let's go to you.
Thanks for that intro, Charlie. I love the heat, but I don't want the places I love to get too hot. So I think we can still meet in the middle on that. But yeah, prior to my role as co-founder at Moon 5, I worked for 10 years in advertising technology, actually. And there's an interesting tie, I think, to Charlie's story in that what people might not know is there are these huge data centers that are supporting the incredible amount of compute that makes the decisions to serve what ads to get to you in those days. So my background prior to the time to transition my career full-time to climate was really becoming obsessed with where can I have that highest marginal impact as an individual, and finding out how to be an activist within my workplace turned out to be the solution for me, and then eventually transitioning my career more fully. At Moon 5, we, as Melissa mentioned, we're doing EV charging for apartment buildings.
Thanks, Gabe. Shruti.
I actually have known Gabe for all of those 10 years. We used to work together back during our ad tech days. And I'm at the stage where I'm making the transition over to climate. I'm an early member of Carl, which is, and we're kind of part of that conversation around how do you make your existing job a green job? So I really started to get involved and think about this in 2020 when I started volunteering with organizations like Carl and 350 Bay Area. We were all remote around that time. And I started working for a biotech software company as a customer success manager. We were fully remote. And my journey started with just creating a small Slack community with 30 people to start. And that mushroomed into forming a green team at Benchling and connecting that to sales strategy, to what our HR team could do, to what the recruitment team could use in terms of marketing materials for getting candidates to come on board, and for helping our branding and kind of large scale corporate marketing efforts, as well as our overall strategy. So that was a really exciting development. And then by the time I left Benchling, we were at over 130 people on our Slack forum. I'm having to kind of restart that process. To Charlie's point earlier, I work for a small Series A AI company right now, and I'm trying to kind of slowly come back to that motion. My first big achievement was getting a compost bin on the corner. And that's what I've done so far in the last few months. And the next step, the center, I get back to the theme of education. I'm trying to get Recology to come do a late Earth Day celebration this Friday so that people can get educated on good recycling practices and try to change the culture from within our small company.
All right, Shruti, I think I want to start with you and carry on with what you were talking about here, because that compost bin story to start, it might seem like a small thing, but this is one of those moments where you get people to start talking about climate, and we don't talk about climate enough. And Gabe, you have a stat on how often we talk about climate. What was that?
For those looking to learn more about the space, highly recommend checking out the Climate Reality Project, which is Al Gore's nonprofit. One of the stats that they have is that the average American talks about climate to another person once every 2 months, which is, as a person who eats, breathes, sleeps, and has nightmares about it, an everyday constant thing and shocking. So the first thing you can do is just talk about it. Just find ways to get out there and have those conversations. And it's such an important starting place.
And Shruti, you were mentioning how you brought this into a previous company, a compost bin, and you found yourself like sorting out trash from it.
Exactly. So at my current company, when I first started, the first thing I noticed, this is not something you could take for granted even in the Bay Area. There was no compost bin on the corner. And so I started looking into how I could make that happen. At all my previous jobs, it's been something we've been able to just come in and see. It took 2 months of talking to our building management, who talked to Recology, to get that compost bin on the corner. And I was super proud of myself. I was like, my job's done here. And then I started to notice that people were putting in plastic trash and takeout containers into that compost bin. So I was actually physically removing the trash and putting it into the right receptacles. And I was like, something's off here. Once I got past the self-righteous surge of how are people doing this, right? I got to maybe people just don't know what the giant green bin does or is for. I didn't tell anyone about it. So then I Slacked our entire kind of on-site channel on Slack and said, hey, the new green bin is actually the compost bin and only organic waste goes in there. That started a whole discussion. An engineering manager weighed in and he said, maybe you want to put up some signage. People might not know the difference. There might be people who are colorblind who can't tell the difference between green and blue. I never thought about these things, right? So in addition to that conversation, I thought maybe it's better for people to have an organized expert like Recology to come on board on site and to educate everyone around it. Especially because Recology is amazing. They actually have a free service for the Bay Area, and each city's rules are different. So it's good for people to know what their local laws and rules are.
Yeah, Recology, for those who aren't local to the Bay Area, is our trash and recycling company. So you may have some other things where you all live. Shruti, where did that lead into? So like a small compost, bin, a win there, started discussions, engineering managers, everybody else, people started using it. What was the ripple effect of that, and how do you feel about that?
The ripple effect of that was more people starting conversations around this. I'm hoping that people take the education because a lot of people live locally. So if the rules are for Mountain View, which is where our headquarters are based, they can take that home and put those practices into place. I'm hoping that this encourages people to start more conversations. I had a random conversation at the water cooler with an engineer after the compost bin came in who thanked me from his entire family. And this is not a conversation we would have had otherwise. And he was just so excited because people could bring that aspect of themselves to work. And people may care about climate and want to talk about it, but they may just not think about it, or it might not be top of mind, or they may not feel comfortable because the conversation hasn't been started yet. So it's as simple as one person raising their hand and saying, I will talk about it, that gives other people the freedom or the interest in doing so. And what that led to at my previous role at Benchling was us doing large-scale events, becoming a prominent part of our website, becoming a part of our marketing materials, getting our internal marketing communications team involved. They would add traffic to our Slack channel because they would advertise all of the events that we were doing internally because they were so invested, which led to additional sales conversations, better relationships with clients. I mean, a tiny action, like starting a community movement, can have a huge ripple effect throughout the company.
I love it. And I've heard similar feedback from people even from the podcast who are, I had an episode on restaurants and somebody came up to me and told me that they now take their own takeout containers to restaurants with them so they can reuse them. And I don't think we'll ever know the impact of all of our efforts. So even as small as you want to start, it makes a difference. And then we're going to talk also about some larger projects and efforts that, that are kind of like shifting the way businesses are doing work with their customers and building programs. And Charlie, I'd love to turn it to you to talk a little bit about your time at Gartner.
Absolutely. And I love Shruti, your story, because I think the big aha that I had in my own journey is like, if we're not doing things sustainably, sometimes there's just not a good reason for it. Sometimes it's because nobody has thought to raise their hand and give themselves permission to be the person to go work on the problem and solve the problem. And in my case, like, for my backstory of how I actually became a full-time sustainability professional, it very much started in a similar way, but in a different kind of format. So as I mentioned, I spent about 7 years at Gartner. My first 4 were kind of writing research reports for heads of IT. I don't know how to code. I don't know anything about IT. So I was kind of like getting by, doing my thing. But then I eventually switched over to something I knew a little bit more about, which was supply chain. And my job was effectively an events manager for the supply chain practice. So all these heads of supply chain from all over the world were clients of my company. And I was the guy in charge of the agenda of like, hey, what are these people going to meet and talk about? And so I kind of like talked to my boss and I was like, so I can make them talk about anything? He's like, yeah, as long as it's valuable to them. I'm like, sounds good. Climate it is. And so every single one of my events after that point had a huge, sustainability climate component to it. And we weren't doing it not because people said, no, that's not allowed. No one had just thought to raise their hand and say, hey, what if we try this out? And in my case, the good news is the clients loved it. They really wanted to talk about this stuff. So it was a value add to the company as well. And that became that little snowball effect for me, building the personal brand along with this new value prop for the company, being able to then advocate. I reached out to the head of communications of the CEO and I said, hey, we got to do a video on all the good stuff we're doing on sustainability at these events. And so I got to do like a video for the CEO that the whole company got to see. And nobody told me I couldn't. No one had ever just thought to say, what if I give myself permission? And I just, in my case, got lucky that one of my clients was leading supply chain for Microsoft's consumer hardware. And eventually she's like, hey, I know that you're an events guy. I know that you don't like have an actual tech background, but I like your gumption. Do you want to come start my sustainability team and see what happens? And so that was 5 years ago. But it all came down to it's doing exactly what Shruti said. It's just like someone's got to raise their hand. And there's not a good reason why some people aren't sometimes. And if we give ourselves that permission, we got opportunity here.
So before you were shifting the topic for the events for these Gartner conference, what were the kind of things that they were talking about?
Just business stuff like cost optimization, supply chain resilience. If I were still there right now, I bet we'd be talking about tariffs. All like really important topics, don't get me wrong. But then underneath that, I was like, actually, isn't the circular economy something interesting? Because is that also a way to simplify and reduce the cost of our supply chains? Can that be a competitive edge if we talk about it, clients? And also, what I've learned is these people are hyper competitive with one another. Part of the reason I think I got hired is because my boss saw one of her competitors do a talk, and she's like, oh, I can't let that guy have a sustainability program, and I don't have one. But yeah, no, it's all value add, and people just needed to realize sustainability is also a value add in many cases.
Yeah, and that's a nuance that I think is not super obvious to everybody, is like how to talk about sustainability as a value add. Because if it's just saving the planet for the sake of saving the planet, I'm willing to bet everybody on this call would agree, yes, just do it for the sake of saving our one and only home. But that's not the way business works. So knowing how to speak the language of business and get leaders to think about how this values their customers, lowers their costs, increases revenue in some way. Gabe, do you want to share a little bit about your story here in compute power and ad serving?
I love both of those stories that you're telling and just how important the little pebble that starts that ripple effect can be too, right? How sparking those conversations is so critical, and how the way we talk in a business setting has to be informed by business norms, professionalism, asking the right question. For me, when I was working in ad tech, I was known as the guy who was interested in climate and was interested in these things in my personal life. And people were like, okay, like that's his thing. That's fine. He bikes a lot, part of his personality. But, when I would bring up like climate stuff, or like we have recycling, right? Like we're an office culture, right? We're not a coal plant. We're not an airline. Like, we're not saving the world. We're just like we're just trying to make money, right? There wasn't that awareness. And so even in talking just with my coworkers, they'd say like, well, we can do like a bike to work day, or we can like try to actually, the compost is important. I don't want to play that down at all. At one point, one of our managers had actually placed the coffee machine on top of the compost like bin so that it was just blocked. And then when I was like, can we move that so I can still put stuff in there? He was like, oh, political correctness. Girl, I'm just trying to throw my trash away, dude. Oh. But as I was going through this journey, I'm a little bit obsessive about, where can my action have the most marginal difference? Where can I really have an impact with what I'm doing? Because I get frustrated by this idea of like, especially a lot of corporations will say, oh yeah, we're green. We have posted on Slack for Earth Day that one time. Wasn't that great? So what do we do that actually makes a difference? And where's the least amount of effort to do that? And as I was obsessively researching this in my own life, doing like Meatless Mondays, biking to work, doing all these things, I learned about the carbon impact of what was at the time a newer trend called Bitcoin. And I read a fact that Bitcoin at that point had the carbon impacts of the country of New Zealand, which was mind blowing at the time. Now it's much, much bigger. And now everyone knows about these things. But I just thought, wow, that's so interesting. That's because of all the servers that they're running and all the compute. We have a whole room full of servers over there. Like we have a ton of compute costs that's happening when you open a new web page. That web page pings hundreds of advertisers and thousands of auction houses, and decisioning happening back and forth for every single ad space. It's very complex. So what I started doing is really just, I'm not going to tell people, I'm going to ask. So during the next all hands AMA, I asked our leadership, what do you see as the number one impact we have as a company on the environment? And where would you place our data centers within that? And that was the first climate action I took at work.
Okay, so you just asked?
I think there's a lot of value in not telling, but asking and teaching instead, because you run into like, oh, this person's moralizing me or whatever. But if you can teach them something they didn't know, you can spark interest. And if you're asking questions, you can spark thought. That was where I started and then kept going from there as well.
So why don't you tell us how that spiraled into? So people are now considering the cost of the data center. Where did that lead to?
Absolutely. So that eventually led to some live conversations on our company all hands and started a bit of a ripple effect internally. After more activism that followed, the company where I was at today is actually on their front page. They are leading with the fact that they own their own servers and are able to be a more environmental ad tech company, that you can bring your business to them. And when you spend your ad dollars, you know that you're minimizing your carbon impact and that's actually a very core part of them as a company. And that happened in a matter of 2 or 3 years in the scope of things, very quick. And that continues to be the case even today with kind of the attack on DEI and everything else. So that little ripple effect can really set off changes that you wouldn't expect.
And, most people here are probably not working at an ad tech company, but you might be working at a company that's buying ads somewhere. So Gabe, how do people make more sustainable ad buying decisions?
Well, if you do have a marketing team or a media buying team on your company and you're curious, you can always pull one of them aside and say, hey, I'm curious about what is your supply path optimization? Are you working to minimize the carbon impact of your ads? I heard that you can actually have more efficient ads if you curate them both for the carbon efficiency that can improve the performance. And if they're a marketing nerd, they'll probably actually love that question. They'll be really interested in hearing more about that. And that's a way that you can learn about one of the impacts you might not have known about from your own company.
That's a great point. Just asking questions of leadership, and then also asking questions of your vendors. Just like I'm vegetarian, and every time I go to a restaurant that doesn't have like a veggie burger or something, I'm always asked for it, even though I know they don't have it. Because I'm like, if I keep asking for it, they're going to know their customers want it, and they're going to start putting it on the menu. Same thing if you're working at a company that's dealing with any supplier or vendor or, company in your supply chain, anything like that.
I'm just imagining you going to like these like hardcore steakhouses, just like they see you every other day. It's like, hey, is my veggie burger here yet?
It's worked. I mean, not at a steakhouse, but we've talked about some of the impacts you all have made. What about the headwinds and roadblocks? Tell us about some of these things that didn't quite go the way you were expecting. How did you get past them?
I think, part of the headwind and the roadblock is really that initial understanding of like, and unfortunately, in corporate America, you kind of have to get these things aligned. It's just like, what is the purpose? What is the point of doing sustainability? Obvious for all of us on this call, of course. But, a business operates under a certain set of expectations and conditions, and there usually has to be this important driver to make it happen. So before I moved into the events business, when I was writing the research for all these IT people, I similarly tried advocating at that point. I was like, we should do a report on the sustainability of IT, and this is in 2013. And then my boss was like, why? And I said, I think it's cool. And that wasn't enough, as it turns out, to like change the course of my company's research. So I think I kind of learned pretty quickly a lot of the headwinds is just if we don't get the language right to the right people at the right time, if we don't bring the value to the customers, to the business, whether it's increasing revenue, increasing market share, reducing cost, attracting talent, there's so many ways you can make the business case. It doesn't have to just be make more money. But if it's not couched in that, I realized I was kind of asking this question over and over. But Louisa, it was like me going to a steakhouse and being like, hey, give me the veggie burger, give me the veggie burger. And they're like, we're never going to give you the veggie burger. And it wasn't until I realized that like I needed to change the way I was having that conversation that I really started to get traction and get the permission afforded to me to start actually bringing sustainability to my events.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
I've got a story that's similar to Charlie's. So when I came into Benchling, there were a lot of employee resource groups tied around identity, nothing for sustainability. And we were a new category. We weren't an employee resource group, so we weren't entitled to the same resources when I started the group and decided to become official. So I had to build a charter, put a presentation together to sell us to the executive team. And how I was able to structure these conversations is gathering some of the chatter on Slack to start with our sales team, constantly asking questions from our clients, because I used to work in the biotech software space. Our clients were putting pressure on us to say, what initiatives are you doing? Can you get certification in this? Because we worked with a lot of agri-tech and food manufacturing companies, in addition to biotech and pharma, where it's top of mind because climate affects healthcare directly. So I captured these questions and stories as part of my presentation, saying, hey, this is actually better for our business. And then we didn't have a budget right away. So we were an official group. I was able to assemble a leadership team of volunteers, but we had no budget because we had to prove ourselves first. So then I started partnering internally with all of the employee resource groups who were really interested in taking a climate angle to the work that they were doing. For example, I did an event with our BIPOC group. It has a significantly larger impact on the BIPOC community because of lack of resources, lack of kind of awareness within the States. And we found parallels in Europe as well. In addition to that, I was able to partner, for example, with our mental health and neurodivergence group and do a beach cleanup day. That was kind of a big marketing push around that. And so they were funding our activities and helping us get more traction. And then eventually I was able to use these conversations to go back to the executive team and say, hey, I want an executive sponsor. We're not an employee resource group, but I want an executive sponsor and I want the same budget so that we can get out there and do these activities on our own.
Great story. Employee resource groups can be quite a valuable way to get the conversation going.
Absolutely. I think those are such critical points. I want to I think expand on something that it's possible some of the attendees are thinking about today, which a bit of an elephant in the room, which is we can talk about these tech companies, which might be like on deck to maybe be thinking in this way in some ways. They have a San Francisco headquarters, they're this way, but we're in a political environment today where there's extra fear about anything that can be labeled DEI or political. And that's been the case in some workplaces, and it might be the case for some of the workplaces for attendees today. And so I just want to recognize that I think it's still very true that any job can be a climate job, but the way that you approach that might change as well. One of the tools that Shruti's mentioned a couple of times that I think is really apparent, and I want to emphasize, is Slack as well. Search through Slack, find those examples, clients reaching out, find other people who might have brought it, talk to them directly, right? Do DMs, help people feel like there's less fear to even connect. For me, and actually in my first group, I didn't get to the point where I started a resource group because they wanted to prioritize the identity part. But what I was able to do was just form individual connections with people who were interested in that. And I was able to start a Slack group that was climate themed. And so even though it wasn't an endorsed group, it was a way that we could share news or share interests or share topics. And there were bike interest groups and there were other interest groups that were unendorsed. And that was something we could talk about. Around Earth Day, you can talk about the fact that 1 in 10 American showed up on the street for the first Earth Day protest. It was the biggest mobilization ever. And that's a fascinating story that you can share in your Slack group without repercussion. I mentioned the manager who had complained about me moving the copy machine to liberate our compost bin as 2PC. You'll run into these perceptions, right? So be aware of your culture at your corporate place and play into that. One of my companies was very bro-y and resistant to this thing, but they had been based in New Orleans. And they had a company culture of whenever there was a big weather event, they would post weather updates and how to stay safe. And so there was this aspect already built in. They weren't calling it climate, but it was about resiliency. How do you create community support for one another? Then I was able to take that culture and in a separate company, piggyback on saying, hey, maybe we can't talk about carbon or something, but how do we talk about employees supporting each other in weather affected places where these weather events are getting stronger? And from that point, you can start that climate conversation. And that can be really important as well.
Yeah, thinking about like instead of the word climate or sustainability, like what is the actual impact to the humans, to the customers, to the bottom line?
I think to add to what you're saying here, the language is really important to land, but there's also a lot of reason for optimism about sustainability despite, changes in the administration, because unfortunately, it's this thing called green hushing where a lot of us are just getting a little quieter about what we're doing. But underneath it, the language of it being tied to impact is really strong still. And so I love this one data point that came out recently. There's this thing called the Carbon Disclosure Project. It is a way for companies all across the world to report their emissions in a standardized way in a standardized database, and then they'll run analysis on it. And one of the things that they saw was that the average size of a company making sustainability commitments was getting smaller. And that's great because I'm at Microsoft. We started in 2020 with our big bang, everything, but we're also a multi-trillion-dollar company. But, now the smaller companies, the ones that might have otherwise kind of historically resisted this, are setting their own targets. And that's really optimistic. And one of the reasons why it goes to Louisa, what you were saying, which is it's because we're asking them to do it. At my company, we are asking our suppliers, it's like, if you don't decarbonize, we're going to have some hard conversations. And then on the other side of it, they're having their own customers come to them and say like, hey, I know you're a steakhouse, but you really need to start offering some vegetarian options here. And it's almost like that pincer effect is always putting the value to the business at the front. It's a sneaky way to keep it moving despite kind of these political fears that go, which are very real, by the way. But that's not going to stop the work because the value train has left the station as to why this matters to companies.
I'm hearing more conversations around SF Climate Week this week about fear from activists. And for folks who don't know, I'm actually on a visa from another country. The fear is real. I want to kind of highlight that it is real. But to your point, Charlie, people showing up, using the influence that they have to move the conversation forward, especially if they have the access and ability to do so, can really have a huge, meaningful impact and empower other people to show up. There's value in showing up.
Thank you all for sharing that. I'm going to ask one more question. What advice would each of you give somebody just starting out?
I mentioned about asking questions earlier, and I think that that's really critical. But we're in a moment where some people have been saying, I feel dread. I feel responsive. I feel trapped. I feel like I can't do something. What's next? There's so much going on in the world. I'm so paralyzed by the news. And I think connecting with other people, finding joy in community, getting inspired by people who are building new things and really interested in hard problems, and just finding a practice of cultivating hope that will push you forward to doing new things, whether it's composting at home, having secret conversations about climate with your coworkers, or petitioning for an executive sponsor for environmental group. Like, find that hope that keeps you involved, that keeps you active. Protect that spark most of all. And I think that that's something that we as a community really need to prioritize in good and bad times so that we can keep it moving, as Charlie was saying. Just keep it moving.
And I'm glad you went first here, Gabe, because you brought up an excellent point around just like the way that we show up around sustainability to get people excited to follow us on the journey is also super important because, I've seen the opposite happen where people who are big climate activists within a company take the more doom and gloom approach, and then they kind of try to do the shock and awe. And it turns out like if you're someone who's kind of not super into the climate, that's kind of a good way to turn them off. And so the big aha we had at Microsoft to really get things moving was shifting it away from like this existential crisis, even though it is, into more of this irresistible opportunity that was fun to work on. And people like, so for example, I've got this little mouse. We made this mouse out of ocean plastic back in like 2021. Literally, trawlers out in the Pacific Ocean getting stuff out of the garbage patch, dumped it on a table and like, this stuff is awful. This stuff really sucks. Can we make a mouse out of it? And like that was a really fun, like exciting way to get all the designers and the engineers like super pumped about it. We weren't saying, hey, if you don't do this, the planet's going to explode. We kind of put the fun into that sustainability. And I really think that like that's an awesome way to start our own journeys, is to get people excited to come with us on those journeys.
I love hearing both of those things, and I'm getting so many great ideas. But my advice to someone is don't be afraid to start small. Showing up is step one. If it's something tiny, like you make a decision to compost one extra thing in your life, that's a big deal. If you can talk about it with someone else, that's a big deal. Just start small, do what you can.
Such great advice. Thank you all. If anybody has a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll call on you and you can ask a question to anybody.
I'll take the first one on Kylie's, and then we can pass it around because I was reading it. How any additional trips to land the interview? My tip here is a good one, and this is something I talk about in my book as well, is you can almost think of sustainability at companies as being 3 concentric circles that grow. And I think we sometimes do ourselves a disservice by looking at the smallest and the hardest to attack circle, which is jobs that literally have sustainability in the title. Those are incredibly competitive. Like, and not to say you can't get them, but when I post roles for myself on at Microsoft, I get 200 applicants in the first couple of hours. And it's like, it's really cool work if you can get it, but it's actually not where a lot of the impact happens. I think, expanding that aperture and seeing that second concentric circle is like, if you're just working at a sustainability forward company, any job there is a sustainability job. If you're working for a solar company, you don't have to be the person actually installing the panels. You can be the person at the front desk. You can be the accountant. You can be the lawyer. Any of those jobs are going to be a sustainability job. And then even there, going to the point of this conversation, any job at any company can be a sustainability job. So part of, I think, Kylie, to the question of how additional tips to land the interview, I would say, interview on stuff you're really good at already. Don't feel like you have to throw away your background to go fit yourself into that smallest circle, and use that as your leverage and your wedge to build the sustainability career from the jobs and the skill set and the passion that you already have. Hopefully that's helpful, but I got to tell you, so many people really hyperfixate on having sustainability in the title as the only way to do it. Couldn't be further from the truth.
I'm happy to take Emily's question, which is similar, but I fully endorse what you were saying, Charlie, too. And Emily, your question is somewhat similar. What would be your best advice to step into a full-time climate/sustainability role? And I'll kind of leave the sustainability part aside since I think Charlie addressed that well. But as someone who myself I'm now celebrating a year as co-founder of Moon 5, which is EV charging in multifamily homes. Do check us out, especially if you're a renter and you're like, I want charging, but my landlord's really hard to deal with. And how do I kind of unlock that? That's something we're working on. So we'd love to hear from you. And I think things that really got me through was educating myself and finding something more specific. I love talking to people who want to make that transition, and it can be very challenging sometimes to having those conversations where I say, great, what do you want to do? And they say, I think climate change is such an impactful thing and I want to make a difference. And I say, I love that. I love your spirit. I don't know what to do with that, even as someone who has a growing network in the space, because business happens at a very micro level, right? For me, it's EV charging in multifamily homes in the middle of the market with buildings from 50 to 200 units. And I got to that place because sustainability is so huge. It's not even really an industry. It's like a theme that I took the climate-based fellowship, which was very helpful to me. I took climate reality project courses, which I found very helpful. I know Terra.do does some great courses. And that enabled me to go from the place where I was so determined to have an impact to then understanding, when someone started talking about an industry within that, what were they really working on? What were they really doing? What did that technology look like? What did those jobs look like? What's the different carbon impact of like putting in a HVAC system versus an EV charging system, right? That might be important to you too. Maybe you're just obsessed with the ocean, like go towards where you're drawn, but find something more specific and take some real time learning about getting into those more specific places so that next time when you step up to talk to someone like me or Charlie or Shruti, I say, what are you interested in? You can get to a point of like, I'm interested more on the sales side. I am still pretty broad. I'm interested in EV charging or HVAC, but I know I want to get into housing somehow. Once you're there, great. I know people. I can think of things. Let's have an interesting conversation about that and we can get to it a lot faster.
Did you want to answer Nitin's? Gabe, what was the name of that fellowship?
I did Climate Base. Climate Base is actually sponsor of SF Climate Week, so you might be seeing their logo around a lot. I highly recommend that. 1.5 is another really great one. They partner with Climate Base. Their curriculum is incredible. I've heard good things of TerraDo. They're also very popular. I haven't personally done it, but our chief of staff actually transitioned by doing that. It's not a guarantee that it gets you into any job or anything, but it just helps you learn about out there so you can then point yourself in that direction in a more informed way.
I did TerraDo. All of us are open if anybody wants to reach out and connect and dive deeper into any of these. We have another question. As someone coming into the space with experience working with community and environmental justice, is there a role for such voices in industry? In a lot of spaces during SF Climate Week, it sounds like companies do not think about UX social impact until much later in the process. And second, how do you all balance the larger thing that the company does, say AI computing, now used in a lot of extractive vis-a-vis the smaller actions that one can take, like installing a compost bin?
So I actually got started in the volunteering space as an activist with 350 Bay Area and looked to how I could bring that culture into the corporate workspace. Some of the kind of initiatives, one thing I found was that Benchling had a culture that empowers people to speak up. And even though we're a biotech software company, to Charlie's point earlier, we have a big impact on carbon footprint because we were trying to get scientists to digitize their documentation and data management on the back end. And we were trying to digitize inventory management. Now that's not obvious, right? Benchling is not advertised as a company in the sustainability space, but the work that we do has a big impact on sustainability. You can definitely find that match and look for those kinds of companies as well. I think Adobe is another example. When I was looking into doing research on the sustainability space, looking to make that transition, I wouldn't have thought of Adobe, but digitizing documentation is something that can have a big carbon impact. So kind of thinking creatively in terms of what impact these jobs can have. Another area I would look at is government and policy. Actually, if you have a strong ability to organize community and speak and communicate, government and policy, I have friends who work in the government who started working on energy policy, and they have a lot of impact there, because they can define how the city does its business and how California does its business. So speaking to your second question, I actually work for an artificial intelligence company now as a customer success manager. And what I'm trying to think through is look at how I can influence the culture at my company. I attended a talk yesterday that talked about the intersection between climate and AI at SF Climate Week. I got so many ideas around how you can tie things back to a business impact. Essentially, one component of this is if you focus on efficiency, you cut costs, and that is automatically an environmental savings. It's also better for the company, regardless of which industry you're in. So you can start thinking through these types of problems.
And the one thing I'll add on top of what Shruti said to add to the first part of your question is, so Microsoft actually has a full-time director of environmental justice, and we also have an entire team dedicated to community development. You'd be amazed because, I mean, there's a lot of value add to it. If we're going to build a new data center, a new community, we need to make sure that that community actually wants us to be there. And there's where a lot of the community kind of relationships, the engagement, making sure that we're giving back to those communities, not just extracting from them, is a huge part of our license to operate. And if we don't do that, then they're not going to let us come in. So there's a ton of value for that skill set for sure, in many ways, in addition to what Shruti said.
I transitioned into climate, but when I was looking at my job, I'm like, okay, but like if I find a job, maybe I think Microsoft actually, like their promise is really powerful in terms of their climate goals. LinkedIn's another subsidiary of Microsoft. There are workplaces where I thought, maybe I'll bring my skills to one of these other companies, even though it's not directly working on it, because I want to reward that company with the value that I bring because I'm aligned with their mission. And I would feel good about showing up at work there. Like you're bringing real value to that company and you're rewarding them for having a mission and being aligned on that. So do your research. if it's in an interview, it's an environment where you can ask about what they're doing on that side, right? It's an environment where you can bring it's the same thing as the veggie burger. Do you have the veggie burger? Are you really considering this? And that's the way that you can have an impact on a company before you work there. Those are very powerful spaces. And this is such a critical question. Like, I joined the startup that I'm on because I looked at how people in affordable units, people in multifamily, people on that side of the market weren't getting served, that it was just people in luxury condos or whatever you want to call them. And where that wasn't the case, it was not a great service. It was pretty extractive, and we wanted to do something different. Even then, for us, that's core to our mission, and that's something that's really important to us. But you have to really work at figuring out how to make the capitalistic system work in those directions, because there's a lot of history where that has not served marginalized communities. And I think that as optimistic as we can be, we have to be real about that. And you have to work twice as hard if you want to stop the flow of a river that was dug by many generations of misdeeds.
Thank you all so much. Marta, I do see your question here about imposter syndrome. You don't need to be a climate scientist to talk about this. Like, you showed up here, you already know some of what needs to happen. And when you talk to people in your companies or your jobs, they're going to have more ideas, and just work with everybody. Talk to people who make financial decisions in the finance team, the product team, the leadership team. How do they make decisions, and how can you start to think about the climate impact of your company? And with that, I'll turn it to Saba.
Thank you, Louisa. Hi, everyone. I'm Saba Gabramak, also with Carl. And thank you to our wonderful panelists. Some of the interesting things that you come up with in like organizations that have been around for decades is like copies of copies of copies of copies. Final, second final, third final files over files. And then everyone has a copy of them too. So digital management is really a great place to start.
Or if one action you can take at work next week to make your job a greener job, what could you do? And then please do feel free to reach out to any of us if you'd like to continue the conversation. We're happy to chat. Thank you so much for joining.